Today I'm going to be talking about Zack Snyder's Watchmen, a film I initially hated when I first saw it many years ago. Have my thoughts changed? Let's get into it. If you're not familiar with Watchmen, I believe this film released in 2009 and is based off the graphic novel of the same name from Alan Moore. It is a very heavily thematic graphic novel and is considered to be perhaps the greatest graphic novel of all time by many people that collect comic books and graphic novels. So Zack Snyder had a pretty monumental task ahead of him to adapt this film. And as you know by his reputation, he doesn't work for a lot of people, and Watchmen kind of suffered a similar fate. Now, I'm someone who has experienced both sides of the Watchmen discourse because when I first watched it, I hated this movie. And then after a few rewatches as I got older, the film really grew on me, and after my latest rewatch, I just was reminded so powerfully of how special this film is and how it kind of inspired a whole era of different kinds of superhero series and movies that have only just started springing up today. Now, I think when I first watched it and I didn't really like it, it was because I was just the wrong target audience for the film. I was a little bit too young for this movie. I didn't really understand its themes, and I was about, I think, 13 or 14, I can't really remember, and the graphic nature of it all just really turned me off. I was not a fan of violent movies back then. I kind of am now. So naturally, as I got older and matured and could understand the themes and was accustomed to seeing such a mature film, I really, really loved it, and it's just completely grown on me since. I think the first thing that's really worth talking about with this film is just the tone of it all. Zack Snyder captures a real gritty, dark, cynical world here that just perfectly works for his style of filmmaking. The Watchmen are a bunch of characters that have grown old, tired, and want to move on from their superhero gimmick, but then some are still trapped in it and have no intention of moving on from that because that is kind of their saving grace in life and is the thing that stops them from being probably a pretty evil person. These characters are very flawed. Some of them are not good people, and it kind of draws similarities to The Boys, I think, in a lot of ways. Especially the graphic nature of it all too. There's a lot of real-world applications that Watchmen has that I really like. There's a lot of commentary on the Cold War and the Vietnam War and nuclear weaponry and the way that governments flex them to intimidate other national superpowers. A lot of that is entrenched in this story alongside examining each character and how they've moved on from who they used to be and the way that the world has moved on from superheroes. Zack Snyder also has a great eye for cinematography and is able to one-to-one capture exact panels from the comic book, which just looks so pretty and is aged beautifully over time. He is known to use an abundance of slow-mo in his films, and sometimes that can be really annoying. You take Rebel Moon, for example, it becomes incredibly annoying. I didn't like seeing it all that much in that film. But for Watchmen, it really works. And in a lot of those action sequences, he is able to capture just such a badass feeling and is able to capture the most grotesque details of some of this violence. Once again, I wouldn't really recommend it to a more younger demographic for sure, but as a mature rated comic book film, this is as good as it gets. Going into the exact characters, I really love them too. Rorschach being my favorite. He's that real gritty, Batman-esque kind of character, except he more strays the line of being someone who could have been a pretty terrible person. He has this really rough upbringing, seeing his mum as a sex worker and being constantly abused by her mum and seeing her take on different lovers all the time, him being bullied as a child, kind of makes him become this very violent person in nature. And you see that throughout the film. There's so many brutal sequences featuring this character. But what I loved the most about him was his unwillingness to let go of who he was. All these other characters are kind of moving on from that, while Rorschach is still stuck in it. There's a great conversation between him and Night Owl. Night Owl, played by Patrick Wilson, does a fantastic job. Is also a character that is kind of moved on and is happy just being himself now, and kind of looks back at that time as just the good old days. Well, Rorschach is still stuck heavily in it, so when these characters talk pretty early on in the film, they kind of have a clash of ideologies here. And I think that's just really deeply thought-provoking and incredibly interesting. I think, though, a really underrated scene, and it is quite sickening to look at times, is incredibly powerful for Rorschach's beginning. You see why he takes this very hard approach towards criminals and why he's so brutal. He sees what these criminals did to a little girl that he kind of let go the first time. And from there, you just see him become so violent. And it's unrelenting. It's very graphic. But I think that scene was just so incredibly powerful and cathartic and tells you so much about the character. The other character that I just find super interesting is Dr. Manhattan. Probably the most powerful comic book character that you could possibly ever see on the big screen. He's basically a god. And because of that, he kind of starts to have a complex of one in a way where he just doesn't care about humanity anymore. He's so far removed from that they feel so beneath him. And because of that, people are trying to pull the strings and take advantage of that. And you kind of see that happen later and later into the film as he's unintentionally being used as a weapon. He's consistently battling with his just care for humanity and feeling anything at all as he just becomes so much more powerful. And you kind of get sick of it as he just keeps getting berated. And it's a theme that you kind of see play out in Batman vs. Superman. I actually think it's better fleshed out in Watchmen than it is Batman vs. Superman. But you see Zack Snyder really play with the idea of, if these super powerful beings existed on Earth, what would they be like? You know, how would the people treat them? And I feel like it would be something similar to this. And then underneath all of this, the big scale consequences of what is happening to the world and a potential World War III coming, there is just this great investigative storyline with Rorschach about figuring out who's killing off certain members of the Watchmen, as that is something that is taking place throughout the duration of the film. And through that, you get to explore some of the older members of the Watchmen, like the comedian, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. He's fantastic in this role and plays just such a despicable character. He does so much vile things in this film that you just hate him. And Zack Snyder utilizes that in a very purposeful way. There's one scene where he's in Vietnam with Dr. Manhattan, and there's a great line of dialogue that happens right after he does something pretty despicable.
You could have turned the gun into steam, the bullets into mercury, the bottle into goddamn snowflakes, but you didn't, did you? You really don't give a damn about human beings.
That kind of makes you question not only the comedian, but Dr. Manhattan and all these other characters, and where their morals actually stand, and when are they willing to actually step in and help someone. Once again, a very good piece of dialogue that you don't really see too much from Zack Snyder movies, so I've got to give credit where credit is due. I would say there are some flaws with this movie. I don't think it's perfect or a masterpiece or anything like that. I just think it's really, really excellent. And the weaknesses kind of come, I think, from Night Owl and Silk Spectre. There is this kind of love story happening, and I don't mind it. It's just the way that kind of arc concludes just feels a little bit shortchanged and disappointing for me personally. It just doesn't go exactly where I want it to. And the third act in Antarctica is a little bit hit and miss for me. I think what they do with Dr. Manhattan, just, you kind of have to disregard a lot of things for it to work. And I think that's where you see the negatives in Zack Snyder's writing play out here. There's probably a lot more details in the graphic novel that I think would explain this a little bit better, but in the movie it just doesn't quite translate as well with what Ozymandias is doing and his overall plan. I just don't think it quite works the way it should. In theory, it does, but when you see it play out in the film, it just doesn't quite work for me. Another quick negative that I have with this film, there is a sex scene in here, and it's just really corny and awkward and cheesy. Doesn't work at all. I don't know why it was put into the film. It doesn't work. Look, overall, I understand why Watchmen is a very divisive film, but I really, really enjoy it, and I think it's a lot more influential than people give it credit for. As a score, I'm going to give Watchmen a 4.5 out of 5. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I have yet to fully see the TV show, but I would eventually like to get into it properly one day, because I have heard so many great things. Those are my thoughts towards Watchmen. Let me know what you think about the film in the comments below. Are you a fan? Do you hate the film? I'd love to know your thoughts. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.